Courtroom 304 hummed with its usual tension. Papers rustling, heels clacking against polished wood, hushed whispers bouncing between spectators. Judge Helen Brooks sat tall behind the bench, fingers curled around the old oak gavel her father once gifted her when she graduated law school. She'd presided over hundreds of cases, CEOs, drug offenders, survivors, petty criminals, but nothing had ever shaken her the way this case was about to. The state of Georgia versus Caleb Moore, the bailiff announced. The name hit her like a distant echo wrapped in nostalgia. She lifted her gaze, and time stopped. Standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not just another defendant. It was Caleb, her childhood best friend. The boy who once lay beside her on warm summer nights beneath the stars, whispering dreams of leaving their racially divided town behind. Helen's grip tightened around the gavel. She was no longer just a judge. She was someone staring directly into the eyes of a boy she had lost to the cruelty of their childhood world. Caleb's face had aged, leaner, sharper, carved by years of hardship. But his eyes? They hadn't changed. They still held the quiet determination of the boy who once promised her, "No matter what, we've got each other's backs." Helen realized she was gripping the gavel so tightly her knuckles had whitened. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Moore, how do you plead?" His voice was raspy, tired but unwavering. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart thudded. She wanted to pause the trial, demand an explanation. Where had life taken him? How had their paths twisted so far apart? But judges don't get to ask questions like that. Not here, not now. As Prosecutor Mason Hale began his opening statement, Helen's mind wandered. She wasn't hearing charges. She was hearing bicycle wheels spinning through dirt roads, the laughter of two kids who had once believed they could rewrite the world, if only they could grow up fast enough. Now, only one of them had. Helen was 13 the last time she saw Caleb as a friend. They'd sneak off to the creek past the old sycamore trees, where the world didn't care about skin color or last names. It was their haven, away from judging eyes. Until one afternoon, her father found them sitting on the front porch, sipping iced tea and laughing like siblings. His face turned red, his voice thundered. "Inside." "Now." She hesitated. Caleb stood still. "It's okay," he whispered. "Go. I'll see you around." But they never did. His family moved within a week, like a secret packed into cardboard boxes and erased from the neighborhood. Helen threw herself into school. He disappeared into memory. Now he stood before her, not as the future engineer he once dreamed of becoming, but as a man on trial for armed robbery and assault. She felt her throat tighten. How could this be his story? Prosecutor Mason Hale laid out the case. Caleb was accused of robbing a convenience store at gunpoint, assaulting the cashier, and fleeing with $300 in cash. Police found him blocks away, unarmed but carrying money. "There's surveillance footage," Mason stated flatly, "and a victim's testimony." Helen watched the footage. It was grainy, low quality, showing a hooded figure in red bursting into the store, gesturing wildly, then fleeing the frame. The face was obscured, nothing definitive. The cashier's testimony was shaky. Under cross-examination by defense attorney Nina Grant, he admitted the assailant's face had been partially covered. "It was dark. I think it was him," he said uncertainly. Then Nina turned to the jury. "You're being asked to convict a man without hard evidence. No fingerprints, no weapon, no clear ID." Helen looked at Caleb. He sat still, eyes forward, jaw clenched. He wasn't asking for pity, just for someone to actually look, beyond assumptions, beyond his record, into the truth. Nina Grant called her next witness, Caleb's mother, Mrs. Lorna Moore. "He was with me," she said softly. "I slipped in the bathroom. He rushed me to the ER. We didn't leave the hospital till midnight." She produced hospital discharge forms, receipts from the pharmacy, and even a parking stub. Mason Hale wasn't satisfied. He pointed to the timestamp on the discharge sheet, 11:15 p.m. "But you said it was closer to midnight. That's a discrepancy, isn't it?" Mrs. Moore's eyes welled. "I wasn't watching the clock. I was scared. I thought I broke my hip." Some jury members looked unsure. Helen watched them closely. A 5-minute gap could decide Caleb's future. Could it really come down to a timestamp? This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war between doubt and faith, between what can be proven and what can be felt. That night, Helen sat in her chambers, unable to focus. In her drawer was something she hadn't touched in years, an old notebook, Caleb's notebook. She opened it, slowly flipping through childish doodles and dreams. On one page, a sketch of a bridge, drawn in shaky pencil lines, with a single caption, "One day I'll build something that brings people together." Tears welled in her eyes. This wasn't the drawing of a criminal. It was the dream of a boy who saw past fences, laws, and skin color. Then came the envelope, placed silently on her desk by someone unknown. Inside was a note. "Find Terrence Gaines." He saw what happened. LM. Terrence. She hadn't heard that name in decades. She picked up her phone. The next day, Terrence Gaines, a man with tired eyes and salt and pepper hair, took the stand. Nina approached him carefully. "Mr. Gaines, where were you the night of April 17th? "On the sidewalk near the Redstone Deli," he said. "I saw it all." "And was it Mr. Moore who committed the robbery?" Terrence shook his head. "Number it was Derek Shaw. Wears the same red hoodie. He's part of the Redstone crew. Looks a lot like Caleb if you're not paying attention." "Why didn't you come forward?" He swallowed. "Who's gonna believe me? I've done time. People see my face and stop listening." Helen watched him intently. His voice wasn't just testifying, it was apologizing to every man who'd been ignored because of their past. In that moment, a fragile truth started to rise above the noise. As Terrence left the stand, the room was silent. Even Mason Hale looked uneasy. Nina turned toward the jury. "We've heard from someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose. He didn't just speak, he risked everything to set the record straight." Mason tried to discredit Terrence, waving his criminal record like a flag. "Ladies and gentlemen, we can't rewrite history based on hearsay from someone with a rap sheet." But the jury didn't flinch. Some crossed their arms. Others looked at Caleb. Helen leaned back, letting the silence linger. In that silence, something beautiful stirred, a collective second thought. Despite Nina's warning, Caleb took the stand. "I've made mistakes," he admitted. "I've stolen food. I've slept under bridges. I've been judged by my record more times than I can count. But I didn't rob that store." His voice cracked. "I was with my mom. She needed me. That's all I've wanted, to be someone who can show up for the people I love." Helen watched the jury carefully. They weren't just listening, they were feeling. Caleb wasn't just defending his innocence, he was demanding to be seen as human. For the first time in a long time, Helen felt the courtroom was no longer judging a criminal, it was confronting its own assumptions. That night, Helen stared at the courthouse ceiling. She thought about justice, not the kind written in law books, but the kind that lives in the quiet spaces between doubt and belief. She remembered a 12-year-old boy lying in the grass next to her. "Do you think there's a place where people don't care what we look like?" She never answered then. Tonight, she couldn't stop asking herself the same question. The case had become more than a trial. It was a reckoning. For Caleb, for herself, for a system that too often confused silence for guilt. And as the morning sun lit the edges of her desk, Judge Helen Brooks knew tomorrow's verdict wouldn't just determine a man's fate, it would define her own. Morning broke with an eerie calm. Courtroom 304, once filled with murmurs and the rustle of legal briefs, now held a heavy stillness. Judge Helen Brooks arrived earlier than usual. She sat alone for a moment before proceedings began, eyes closed, breathing deeply. Today the jury would deliberate. "Everything's been presented," Nina Grant said quietly, placing her files in order. "All we can do now is wait." Across the room, Caleb sat with his hands folded tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. He hadn't looked at Helen since his testimony, not out of disrespect, but from the weight of memory and restraint. There was too much history between them to risk a glance now. As the courtroom filled, Helen gave her instructions to the jury. "You are to deliberate without bias. You must determine guilt or innocence based solely on the evidence presented, not assumptions, not appearances." But even as she spoke the words, Helen wondered if they were possible. Could a system so rooted in structure ever rise above its own shadows? The jury exited the room, The waiting began. Hours passed. The courtroom emptied and refilled. Reporters made calls. Lawyers exchanged cautious glances. But Caleb remained still, silent in the corner, like a man already rehearsing his future behind bars. Helen retreated briefly to her chambers. There she stared at a faded photo pinned behind her desk. Two children beneath a sycamore tree, laughing, unaware of the world waiting to divide them. She hadn't looked at it in years. Now it burned into her thoughts. She thought of every time she stayed silent when others made cruel jokes. Every time she followed rules instead of asking better questions. Every time she told herself justice was blind when it clearly wasn't. Then came the knock. "The jury has reached a verdict," her clerk said. Helen stood, heart heavy, spine straight. She returned to the bench. This moment would define them all. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with weathered hands and searching eyes, held the verdict in trembling fingers. "In the case of the state of Georgia versus Caleb Moore," she began, voice cracking, "we find the defendant—" A pause that lasted an eternity. "Not guilty." The room erupted in gasps. A woman in the back whispered, "Thank God." Nina Grant closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping in relief. Caleb didn't move. Not right away. He blinked, disoriented, as if his mind couldn't process freedom after so long in chains. Helen brought down the gavel with a quiet authority. "Order in the court. Mr. Moore, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." As everyone stood, shuffled, or cried, Helen remained still. This wasn't victory. It was survival. Caleb had been cleared, yes, but what he had endured could never be erased. The justice system had caught its breath, but not its soul. Most of the courtroom had emptied. Lawyers gathered their notes. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Helen sat at the bench, hands resting flat on the polished surface, as if grounding herself in something real. Caleb approached slowly, his steps tentative. No more chains, no more guards. Just a man and a woman, two childhood friends on opposite ends of power, fate, and time. "I wasn't sure if you remembered me," Caleb said softly. Helen's eyes filled. "I remembered the moment I saw you." "Why didn't you say anything?" She hesitated. "Because I couldn't. If I had, the case might have been compromised." Caleb nodded slowly, lips pressed together. "Justice, right?" She looked down. "That's what we call it." "But it's not fair," he added. "Never really has been. Not for people like me." "I know," Helen whispered. "And I'm sorry." That was all there was to say. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with flashing cameras and hungry questions. But Caleb avoided them all. He slipped out the side door alone. No press conference. No victory lap. Freedom, he had learned, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just the absence of a cage. Helen stayed in her chambers. She dismissed her staff early, locked the door, and stood before the mirror. The robes felt heavy now, not from physical weight, but from the truth they'd carried. Truths she'd ignored for years because they made the job harder. What about the others who weren't lucky enough to have old friends on the bench? What about the men who had no one to speak for them? No forgotten notebooks, no fading photographs. She thought of all the verdicts she'd handed down with a clear conscience, until today taught her how foggy that conscience could be. That night, Helen sat alone in her quiet kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator her only company. In front of her sat a cold cup of tea in an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with tape that had lost its stick. She had written it years ago, in the early days of her judgeship, right after she learned Caleb had dropped out of high school. Back then, she had tried to convince herself it wasn't her fault. Inside was a folded letter, handwritten on lined notebook paper. "Caleb," it began, "I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you. I should have spoken when they told me to stay away. I thought silence would protect me, that it would pass. But it never did. I still think about that summer, the creek, the tree, your laugh. I still believe in you. I hope, wherever you are, you haven't forgotten that we once dreamed big." She had never sent it. She didn't know where he had gone, or maybe she was too afraid to know. Now, decades later, she read the words aloud, voice trembling with shame and truth. Then, with slow reverence, she folded the letter and placed it on her windowsill. no longer hidden, no longer ignored. Some wounds needed to be seen before they could heal. The week after the trial brought no headlines, no cameras, and no celebratory fanfare. But in the quiet corners of Atlanta, small things began to shift. Judge Helen Brooks made quiet but powerful choices. She volunteered for a mentorship program at the juvenile center. She requested to handle reentry court cases, cases that gave people a second chance instead of a permanent record. She started attending monthly community justice meetings, not as a speaker, but as a listener. Meanwhile, Caleb Moore stepped into a small office at a nonprofit called The Turning Point. They helped formerly incarcerated men find housing, employment, and a sense of dignity. The pay was modest, but the work gave him purpose. He worked quietly, never telling his story unless asked. When someone did, he'd say, "I was almost forgotten by the system, but someone remembered who I really was, and that saved me." Neither Helen nor Caleb reached out. Not yet. They both understood that some bridges take time to rebuild. But somewhere, quietly and deliberately, they had begun again. Not where the pain started, but where the healing could. Late one evening, a package arrived at Helen's door. No return address, just her name in neat, familiar handwriting. Inside was a fresh, hardcover sketchbook. She opened it carefully, and on the first page was a drawing, so precise and detailed it took her breath away. A modern bridge arched over a wide river, bathed in morning light. On one side stood a young boy with a backpack. On the other side, a girl in a judge's robe, standing barefoot in the grass. They looked like they were about to meet in the middle. Beneath the sketch, written in perfect block letters, "For the girl who believed in blueprints, P.C.M." Helen pressed the book to her chest. It wasn't just a thank you. It was a memory preserved, a friendship redeemed, and a quiet promise. We were never really lost to each other. The sycamore tree where Helen and Caleb had once spent summers no longer stood. A storm had taken it years ago, splitting the trunk like fate had split their lives. But now in its place grew a young maple. Someone had planted it with care, placed fresh soil at its roots, and surrounded it with wooden benches. On one bench, carved into the backrest, were three simple words: "Justice takes courage." No plaque, no dedication, just the truth, resting quietly beneath open sky. Helen visited it one Saturday, unannounced. She sat on the bench, fingers grazing the carved words. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and in that moment, she didn't feel like a judge. She felt like a girl again, one who had finally come back to the place where everything began. Only now she was strong enough to carry what that place had once denied her, the courage to change it. This was never just a legal case. It was a story about a divided country, a broken system, and two children who made a promise in innocence and tried against all odds to honor it in adulthood. Judge Helen Brooks learned that wearing a robe doesn't make you just, following the rules doesn't make you fair, and keeping silent when you should speak is its own kind of betrayal. Caleb Moore reminded the world that justice doesn't begin with court proceedings. It begins with being seen, not as a number, not as a file, but as a life. Somewhere between verdicts and memories, shame and healing, a bridge had been rebuilt, not just between two people, but between everything they used to believe was impossible. And so this story ends not with applause, but with understanding, with a quiet promise renewed. True justice isn't blind, it sees deeper, and it remembers.